So we want to talk about policy implementation, and this is one of the final stages of Anderson's stage model process. And oftentimes, when we study how policy is made in traditional classes, we kind of stop after stage 3. So we go through the policy agenda where we decide which policies are going to gain our attention. We take a look at the policy formation, in other words, the way that we kind of sift through some of the potential solutions to problems. And then we watch the policy adoption process as it takes place in Congress and with the president being involved. And traditionally, that's kind of where it stops. But the policy implementation stage can be just as important as any of the other stages to the outcomes of public policy. So as we see here, using Anderson's stage model definition, the kind of textbook definition that Anderson provides is that policy implementation is the application of policy by the government's administrative machinery. And kind of the plain English definition is applying the government's policy to the problem. In other words, Congress and the president have passed something. Now it's up to the bureaucracy to be able to implement it or to carry it out, in other words. And that is the stage that we are involved with here. So how can we define this a little bit better than what we saw here? There are a couple of people that have studied this rather intensively. Pressman and Wildowski wrote the probably what was the first book trying to understand the implementation process, particularly at the local level in Berkeley, California, which is where they were professors. And their classic work on policy implementation, they put a lot of thought into the name of the book, and the book is called Implementation. And they really found out that at the end of the day, what Washington wants from policy is often not what Washington gets in local and state implementation. So Pressman and Wildowski define implementation as a process of interaction between the setting of goals and actions geared towards achieving them. Right? Charles Jones, who's also like James Anderson, kind of one of the godfathers of this whole public policy kind of theory movement, defines implementation as those activities directed towards putting a program in effect. And then finally, of course, since we are using James Anderson, he defines implementation as implementation encompasses whatever is done to carry a law into effect, to apply it to the target population, for example, small businesses or motorcycle operators, and to achieve its goals, right? So this is basically just carrying out public policy. Now, here's one way to take a look at the implementation process in a flow chart. So at the top, we have the actual law that was passed by Congress, signed by the president. And then agencies essentially set the rules and the regulations that help to carry out this law. As we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, Congress, does not know all the specifics because they're not professionals in all of these kind of areas of public policy. So they allow regulatory agencies to be able to come up with rules and regulations as those agencies see fit, and they define what those, what areas those can be in. The agencies then carry out whatever those rules or regulations and implement them on top of the organizations or people that are involved in that area of public policy. That then produces outputs, and then we try to study whether or not the outcomes produces intended or unintended consequences. That's how we would study the implementation process. So, with the agencies themselves, though, you see that they are subject to other forces besides just the law, and that is, of course, that Congress and interest groups and even the judiciary can become involved in the process as well during the entire implementation process. Now, let's think back to this idea of iron triangles in macro politics. If it's the bureaucracy that is the one that are kind of defining the way things are going to be implemented, much of this takes place out of the public view in the area of iron triangles, right? So this is where the congressional committees, executive agencies, and interest groups come in, and the details of filling out public policy is not a macro political issue. Instead, it's an issue that's more related to these iron triangles. So much of the rulemaking and the regulations are hashed out between interested political parties. By that, I mean interest groups outside of public view.